The cholera had been working its way through Fort Laramie for 9 days when Marcus Welch knelt beside the Platte River and filled his canteen. The water was brown with suspended sediment, clouded by the passage of 1,000 wagons upstream, and almost certainly contaminated by the waste from camps where men were dying in their own filth. Every trapper at the fort knew better than to drink from the Platte that summer. Most were boiling every drop of water they consumed, adding precious minutes to every meal, burning through firewood they could barely spare. Some had stopped drinking anything but whiskey, figuring alcohol was safer than river water. 3 men had died that week alone. Marcus drank directly from his canteen without hesitation. The water tasted clean, almost sweet, with none of the gritty sediment or foul undertones that characterized the Platte in late summer. He drank deeply, then refilled the canteen and drank again. 50 yards downstream, a man named William Thatcher watched this display with a mixture of horror and fascination. "You've got a death wish, Welch," Thatcher called out. "That water's killed more men this month than all the snake raids combined." Marcus wiped his mouth and looked at Thatcher with the calm expression of a man who understood something others didn't. "Water's fine," he said. "Been drinking from this river for 3 years. Haven't been sick once." This was true, and everyone at Fort Laramie knew it. While cholera swept through the fort in waves, while dysentery turned strong men into hollow-eyed ghosts, while typhoid fever claimed victims seemingly at random, Marcus Welch remained untouched. Some thought he was blessed. Others whispered he'd made some kind of deal with dark forces. A few suspected he had natural immunity, some quirk of constitution that protected him where others fell. They were all wrong. Marcus Welch had knowledge that had been passed down through indigenous communities for generations. Knowledge that European settlers dismissed as superstition, even as they died from drinking water that looked clean but carried invisible death. Knowledge that could save lives if anyone would listen long enough to learn. The secret was in his canteen, or more precisely, in what the water passed through before it reached his canteen. This is exactly what we explore here at Old West Archives, the moments when survival depended on knowledge that crossed cultural boundaries under desperate circumstances. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe to join us as we uncover the innovations that saved lives on the American frontier. And tell us in the comments, what frontier survival technique surprises you most? Now, to understand what Marcus knew and how he'd learned it, we need to understand what was killing people across the frontier in 1847, because cholera wasn't just another disease. It was a terror that transformed clean-looking water into a death sentence, and it was spreading westward with every wagon train that pushed toward Oregon and California. The cholera epidemic of 1832 had been America's first major encounter with the disease. It swept up the Mississippi River from New Orleans, killing thousands in cities that had no understanding of how it spread or how to stop it. By 1847, cholera had become a regular visitor to frontier settlements, arriving with trade caravans and emigrant parties, striking without warning and killing with horrifying speed. The disease was brutal in its efficiency. A healthy man could be laughing at breakfast and dead by sunset. The symptoms were unmistakable and terrifying. Violent diarrhea that drained the body of fluids faster than they could be replaced. Vomiting that prevented any nourishment from staying down. Muscle cramps so severe they could break bones. Skin that turned blue-gray as dehydration advanced. Eyes that sank into the skull. A racing pulse that grew weaker by the hour. And finally, collapse into shock as the body simply ran out of water. Death from cholera was essentially death from extreme dehydration. But in 1847, no one understood this. Medical theory of the era operated under the miasma model, the belief that disease was caused by bad air rising from swamps, rotting vegetation, or concentrated human habitation. Doctors prescribed treatments that made patients worse, bloodletting to balance the humors, opium to stop the diarrhea, which prevented the body from expelling the infection, and various toxic compounds that added poisoning to the list of things the patient's body had to fight. The connection between water and cholera remained invisible to most frontier settlers. Water looked clean, or it looked dirty. If it looked clean, they drank it. If it looked dirty, they might let it settle, or they might just drink it anyway when desperately thirsty. The idea that clear, fresh-looking water could carry deadly disease seemed counterintuitive. After all, they'd been drinking from streams and rivers their entire lives. What they didn't understand was that cholera was caused by a bacterium, Vibrio cholera, that could survive and multiply in water contaminated by human waste. When infected individuals defecated near water sources, or when waste from camps washed into rivers during rain, the bacteria entered the water supply. They were microscopic, invisible to the naked eye, undetectable by taste or smell in most cases. A river could look perfectly clean while carrying enough cholera bacteria to kill everyone who drank from it. The frontier conditions of 1847 created perfect circumstances for waterborne disease transmission. Emigrant parties traveled in large groups, camping beside rivers where hundreds of people would relieve themselves upstream of where others drew drinking water. Trading posts and forts concentrated populations without adequate waste management. Native American communities, displaced from traditional territories and forced into smaller areas with limited water sources, suffered devastating epidemics. The same trails, the same rivers, the same camping spots were used by party after party, each one potentially contaminating the water for those who followed. Marcus Welch had come west in 1844 as part of a fur trading expedition working out of Fort William. He was 26 years old, experienced in wilderness travel from his youth in the Adirondacks, and confident in his ability to survive frontier conditions. That confidence nearly killed him in his first summer. He'd been checking trap lines along a tributary of the Sweetwater River when the sickness hit. It started with stomach cramps he initially dismissed as bad meat. Within hours, he was experiencing diarrhea so severe he couldn't travel. By evening, he was vomiting everything he tried to drink, cramping so hard he could barely move, convinced he was dying alone in the wilderness, with no one to even bury his body. What saved Marcus was geography and luck. He'd collapsed near a seasonal camp used by a family of Iroquois who had migrated west decades earlier, integrating with Shoshone communities, but maintaining many of their traditional practices. The family, an older couple named Joseph and Mary Printup, and their adult daughter Sarah, found Marcus delirious beside the river. They didn't try to move him. Instead, they set up a shelter over him and began treatment that seemed strange to Marcus's fevered mind. They gave him water, but not river water. This water came from a peculiar container that Mary tended constantly, adding river water to the top and drawing clean water from a spigot near the bottom. The water tasted different than anything Marcus had drunk before, clean, with a slightly mineral quality, but nothing like the flat, stale taste of boiled water. They fed him broth made from boiled roots and kept him in shade. They didn't bleed him or dose him with the mercury compounds that frontier doctors prescribed. They simply kept him hydrated and let his body fight the infection. After 3 days of misery, Marcus began to recover. After a week, he was weak but alive. During his recovery, Marcus watched Mary tend her water filter with the attention of someone performing a critical ritual. She would pour river water into the top of a barrel-like container that stood about 3 feet high. The water would slowly seep through layers of something Marcus couldn't see, eventually dripping from a spigot at the bottom into a clean bucket. This filtered water was what the family drank, cooked with, and used for washing wounds. Marcus's fever-addled mind recognized this as important, but he didn't understand why until Joseph explained it in careful, deliberate English during Marcus's second week of recovery. "Water carries sickness," Joseph said, sitting beside Marcus near the evening fire. "Can't see it, can't smell it, but it's there. Animals die upstream, their rot gets in the water. People shit in the river, sickness gets in the water. You drink that water, you get sick. Sometimes you die. This contradicted everything Marcus had been taught about disease, but he couldn't argue with results. He'd drunk directly from the Sweetwater River. He'd gotten violently ill. This family drank only filtered water. They'd been camping beside the same river for weeks without illness. "How does the filter work?" Marcus asked. Joseph gestured to the barrel. "Layers. Each layer catches different things. Takes time, but it makes water safe." Over the next several days, as Marcus regained his strength, Joseph and Mary taught him how to build a water filter using materials available in the wilderness. The knowledge they shared had been passed down through generations of Iroquois builders who had observed connections between water quality and health long before European medical theory acknowledged such connections. The basic principle was elegantly simple. Force water to pass through layers of increasingly fine material, and those layers would trap impurities. The execution required precision and understanding of how different materials filtered different contaminants. The construction began with the container. The Printup family used a wooden barrel they'd gotten in trade, but Joseph showed Marcus how to build an effective filter using hollowed logs, tightly woven baskets sealed with pine pitch, or even cleaned animal stomachs stretched over frames. The critical requirement was that the container be waterproof, except for a controlled outlet at the bottom. The filtering layers were arranged from coarsest at the top to finest at the bottom. The top layer consisted of gravel, stones roughly the size of a man's thumb, washed clean of dirt and debris. This layer caught large particles, leaves, insects, sediment, visible contamination. The gravel needed to be at least 6 inches deep to be effective. Below the gravel came a layer of coarse sand, another 6 inches minimum. This sand was gathered from riverbanks and roasted over fire to kill any organisms living in it. The roasting process was critical. Raw sand could introduce contamination rather than remove it. The sand particles were large enough to let water flow through, but small enough to catch smaller particles that passed through the gravel. The third layer was crushed charcoal, and this was where the filter's real purification power came from. Joseph explained that charcoal grabbed things from water that couldn't be seen. Modern science would later explain this through the concept of adsorption. Charcoal's massive surface area and chemical properties allow it to bind toxins, bacteria, and organic compounds. The Printup family didn't know the chemistry, but they'd observed the results across generations. Water that passed through charcoal tasted cleaner and caused fewer illnesses. Making the charcoal required careful fire management. They burned hardwood, preferably willow or cottonwood, in a controlled fire that was then sealed to prevent complete combustion. This created charcoal rather than ash. The charcoal was crushed into pieces roughly the size of corn kernels and washed to remove ash before being added to the filter. The charcoal layer needed to be at least 8 inches deep. Below the charcoal came another layer of sand, but finer this time. This sand was sifted to remove larger particles, creating a layer of extremely fine grains that caught anything that had passed through the charcoal. 6 inches minimum. The final layer at the bottom was clean cloth, tightly woven cotton or linen that had been boiled to sterilize it. This caught the finest particles and prevented any sand or charcoal from washing into the output water. The outlet at the bottom of the barrel was positioned carefully, high enough that the cloth filter stayed submerged, but low enough that gravity could pull water through all the layers. Joseph showed Marcus how to use a hollowed reed or carved wooden spigot that could be opened and closed to control flow. The entire assembly, from top to bottom, created a filtering column roughly 2.5 feet deep. Water poured in the top would take several hours to work its way through all the layers and drip from the bottom. This slow flow was essential. Water needed time to interact with each filtering layer, particularly the charcoal. The science behind why this system worked wouldn't be fully understood until decades later, but the practical results were immediately obvious. Water that entered brown with sediment emerged clear. Water that smelled faintly of rot emerged nearly odorless. And most critically, Water that carried invisible cholera bacteria emerged clean enough to drink safely. The physical filtration removed most bacteria through sheer mechanical trapping. Cholera bacteria, while microscopic, are still relatively large as microorganisms go, roughly 1 to 3 micrometers in size. The fine sand layer could trap many of them. The charcoal layer removed even more through adsorption, as bacteria and toxins adhered to the charcoal's surface. The cloth at the bottom caught any that somehow passed through all previous layers. No single layer made the water perfectly safe, but the combination of layers achieved what each individual layer couldn't. It was redundant protection, multiple barriers that together reduced bacterial contamination to levels low enough that the human immune system could handle any remaining pathogens. Marcus understood none of the microbiology involved, but he understood results. After 6 weeks with the Print-Up family, learning their methods and helping maintain their filters, he built his own portable version using a cleaned buffalo stomach stretched over a willow frame. The layers were thinner. He couldn't carry a full-sized barrel through the mountains, but the principle was identical. Gravel, sand, charcoal, fine sand, cloth. Water went in dirty, came out clean. When Marcus rejoined his fur trading party in the fall of 1844, he carried his portable filter and began using it exclusively. His companions thought it was an unnecessary complication. Water was everywhere in the mountains. Why spend time filtering when you could just drink from the stream? Marcus didn't argue. He just quietly filtered his water and stayed healthy while others in the party suffered regular bouts of mountain sickness, what we now recognize as giardiasis, dysentery, and various waterborne infections. By the end of that winter, 3 other trappers had asked Marcus to teach them his method. By the next summer, half the trading party was using variants of Marcus's filter system. The knowledge spread slowly through the mountain man community, passed from trapper to trapper as practical survival information rather than medical theory. Most mountain men didn't care why the filters worked. They cared that men who used filters got sick less often than men who didn't. In an environment where a week of dysentery could mean missing the beaver season or dying alone in the wilderness, that was reason enough to learn. But when Marcus returned to Fort Laramie in 1847 with his filter and his clean water, he encountered resistance of a different kind. The fort's population wasn't just trappers anymore. Emigrants were passing through by the thousands, heading west to Oregon and California. These were families, not wilderness-hardened mountain men, and many of them viewed Marcus's water filter with suspicion that bordered on hostility. The resistance came from multiple sources, and understanding it requires understanding the complex mixture of cultural prejudice, medical theory, and practical barriers that prevented life-saving knowledge from spreading as quickly as the diseases it could prevent. The first barrier was medical authority. Fort Laramie had a doctor, Dr. Samuel Whitfield, trained in Philadelphia, confident in his knowledge of medical theory, and utterly convinced that miasma theory explained disease transmission. When Marcus tried to explain that contaminated water caused cholera, Dr. Whitfield dismissed the idea as frontier superstition. Cholera is caused by miasmic vapors arising from decomposing organic matter, Dr. Whitfield explained to a group of immigrants who'd asked about Marcus's water filter. The disease is contracted through breathing foul air, not through drinking water. In fact, drinking plenty of fluids is part of the proper treatment, and there's no reason to complicate the process with elaborate filtration. The doctor's words carried weight that Marcus's experience didn't. Dr. Whitfield had formal medical training. He'd read the latest medical journals from Europe. He spoke with the authority of science and education. Marcus was a trapper who'd learned from Indians, people the emigrants generally viewed as primitive and superstitious. The cultural prejudice was blunt and undeniable. Many emigrants were deeply suspicious of any knowledge that came from Native American sources. They'd been raised on stories of savage Indians, taught to view indigenous people as obstacles to civilization rather than as holders of valuable knowledge. The idea that Native Americans might understand disease prevention better than trained American doctors seemed absurd to many settlers. "You're telling me," one immigrant named Robert Morrison said to Marcus, with barely concealed contempt, "that a bunch of Indians know more about medicine than actual doctors? Indians who can't even read?" Marcus kept his voice steady. "I'm telling you that people who've lived in this country for generations have learned what keeps them healthy. They've observed connections that doctors in Philadelphia haven't seen." Morrison snorted. "Next, you'll be telling me I should be using Indian medicine men instead of real doctors." The frustration Marcus felt was made worse by watching people die from pure stubbornness. The cholera outbreak at Fort Laramie killed 43 people over the course of that summer. Most of them died after drinking from contaminated water sources. Many of them had been warned. Some had even seen Marcus's water filter demonstrated, but they'd chosen to trust Dr. Whitfield's advice, or simply couldn't bring themselves to accept that a primitive filtration system could protect them better than modern medical understanding. The practical barriers to adoption were real, even for those who were willing to try Marcus's method. Building a functional water filter required materials that weren't always available. Clean sand and appropriate gravel could be gathered near rivers, but finding good hardwood for charcoal was challenging in many parts of the frontier. Some regions had only cottonwood or stunted pine. The quality of charcoal made from different woods varied significantly. Crushing charcoal to the right consistency required tools that many immigrants didn't carry. Making a container that was properly waterproof demanded skills in carpentry or leatherwork that some travelers lacked. The cloth for the final filter layer needed to be tightly woven. Coarse burlap wouldn't work, and spare cloth was precious on the frontier. The time investment seemed excessive to people who were trying to cover 20 miles a day on the Oregon Trail. Setting up a filter, letting water slowly drip through, and maintaining the system added hours to daily routines that were already overwhelmed with necessity. It was easier to just boil water, which killed most pathogens without requiring elaborate construction. It was easier still to drink water that looked clean and hope for the best. Marcus understood the practical concerns, so he began experimenting with simplified versions of the print-up family's design. He created a portable filter that fit inside a standard canteen. The filter was a cloth bag filled with a mixture of sand and crushed charcoal, suspended inside the canteen, so water had to pass through it before reaching the drinking spout. This wasn't as effective as the full multi-layer system, but it was better than nothing and could be built with materials any traveler carried. He demonstrated this portable filter to small groups, showing how to fill the canteen with river water, wait an hour for filtration, and then drink water that was noticeably cleaner than the source. Some people adopted it. Many didn't, even after seeing it work. The psychological barrier was perhaps the deepest. Accepting that invisible organisms in water could cause disease required accepting that the world contained threats you couldn't see or smell. This was a disturbing idea in an era when most people believed their senses could detect danger. If water looked clean and smelled fine, it felt wrong to distrust it. The miasma theory, wrong as it was, offered a comforting explanation. Disease came from obviously bad conditions. Swamps smelled bad, so swamp air made you sick. Cities were crowded and dirty, so city air made you sick. This made intuitive sense. The idea that clean-looking mountain stream water could be deadly, while foul-smelling swamp water that had been filtered was safe, inverted common sense. Marcus tried different approaches to overcome this resistance. He showed people samples of unfiltered and filtered water side by side, letting the visible difference in clarity speak for itself. He collected statistics on illness rates among filter users versus non-users, though the data was imperfect and hard to quantify. He found immigrants who'd survived cholera and were willing to testify that they'd gotten sick after drinking river water. Nothing worked as well as simple example. When people watched Marcus drink freely from sources that made others sick, when they observed that he remained healthy while others fell ill, some began to reconsider. By the end of the summer of 1847, perhaps 24 families at Fort Laramie were using some version of water filtration. That was 43 lives saved. but it was also 43 deaths that Marcus couldn't prevent. The scientific understanding of why water filtration worked wouldn't emerge until decades later. In 1854, Dr. John Snow would demonstrate the connection between contaminated water and cholera in London, though his work would be largely ignored initially. In 1884, Robert Koch would identify Vibrio cholera as the bacterial cause of cholera. The development of germ theory would gradually replace miasma theory, though the transition took generations and faced fierce resistance from established medical authorities. By the time the science caught up with the practice, indigenous knowledge systems that had understood water contamination for centuries had been largely destroyed or dismissed. The Iroquois, Shoshone, Cherokee, and countless other nations that had developed water purification techniques were dead from disease, displaced from their territories, or forced to abandon traditional practices in favor of European methods that demonstrably worked less well. This pattern repeated across countless domains of frontier survival. Native Americans had developed sophisticated techniques for food preservation, shelter construction, navigation, and medicine. European settlers arrived with absolute confidence in their own superior knowledge, dismissed indigenous techniques as primitive superstition, and then slowly, reluctantly, painfully learned that the people they displaced often understood the environment better than they did. The water filtration knowledge Marcus learned from the Printup family had been refined across generations of careful observation. They didn't know about bacteria, but they knew that people who drank filtered water got sick less often than people who didn't. They didn't understand adsorption chemistry, but they knew that charcoal made water taste cleaner and seemed to remove things that made people ill. They didn't have microscopes, but they had something more valuable: centuries of empirical data from treating water and observing outcomes. This was science, even if it wasn't recognized as such by European standards. The scientific method, observe, hypothesize, test, refine, was being applied, just without formal documentation or academic institutions. The knowledge was preserved through oral tradition and practical demonstration, rather than written journals. The results were measured in survival rates, rather than published papers. When emigrants dismissed this knowledge as primitive, they were really revealing their own ignorance about what constitutes valid scientific inquiry. The Printup family's water filter worked because its design was based on empirical observation, refined across generations. Dr. Whitfield's treatments often failed because they were based on theoretical models that didn't match reality. The filter was good science, the bloodletting was not. Marcus Welch's role in this story is complicated and representative of broader patterns in frontier history. He was a white trapper who learned life-saving techniques from Native Americans, who benefited enormously from that knowledge, and who then worked to spread that knowledge among other white settlers. He credited the Printup family openly, which was more than many pioneers did with knowledge they'd learned from indigenous sources. But he also benefited from advantages the Printup family didn't have. When Marcus demonstrated water filtration at Fort Laramie, people listened because he was white. When Joseph Printup had tried to explain water purification to trappers years earlier, many had dismissed him as a superstitious Indian. The knowledge was identical, but the messenger determined whether people would accept it. This ugly reality meant that life-saving information often failed to spread, not because it didn't work, but because racial prejudice prevented people from learning from indigenous teachers. The technical aspects of water filtration that Marcus taught were remarkably sophisticated for frontier conditions. The multi-layer system he'd learned from the Printups anticipated modern water treatment principles that wouldn't be formalized for decades. Modern municipal water treatment uses remarkably similar processes: preliminary filtration to remove large particles, chemical treatment, often including activated carbon, which works on the same adsorption principles as the charcoal layer, fine filtration, and finally, disinfection. The frontier system Marcus taught lacked the chemical treatment and disinfection stages, but it incorporated the other elements in a form that could be built with wilderness materials. The charcoal layer deserves particular attention because it demonstrated understanding of chemical purification principles that were far ahead of contemporary European medical knowledge. Activated charcoal, charcoal that has been treated to increase its adsorptive properties, is now a standard component in water filtration, used to remove organic compounds, chlorine, and some bacteria. The print-up family's process of making charcoal through controlled combustion and washing away ash created something very close to activated charcoal, though without the high-temperature activation used in modern industrial processes. The adsorptive properties of charcoal work at the molecular level. The charcoal's surface is covered with tiny pores and chemical sites that attract and bind contaminants. This removes not just bacteria, but also many toxins and compounds that affect water taste and safety. The fact that indigenous water filtration systems incorporated charcoal suggests deep understanding of purification principles, even if the explanation was framed in terms of charcoal grabbing bad things from water, rather than in molecular chemistry terms. The sand layers provided mechanical filtration through increasingly fine mesh sizes. This is the same principle used in modern sand filters, which remain a standard technology in water treatment, despite being one of the oldest filtration methods known to humanity. The key insight is that multiple sand layers of different grain sizes are more effective than a single thick layer, because each layer catches particles that are too small for the previous layer, but too large for the next. The cloth layer at the bottom served multiple purposes. It prevented filter material from washing into the output water, but it also provided a final physical barrier. Tightly woven cloth can trap particles down to a few micrometers in size, small enough to catch many bacteria. Boiling the cloth before installation sterilized it, preventing the filter itself from becoming a source of contamination. The maintenance requirements of these filters demonstrated sophisticated understanding of biological processes, even without formal knowledge of germ theory. The print-up family taught Marcus that filters needed to be cleaned and refreshed regularly. The top gravel layer would become clogged with trapped debris and needed to be removed, washed, and replaced. The charcoal layer would eventually become saturated with adsorbed contaminants and lose effectiveness, requiring replacement. The cloth would develop a biofilm, though they didn't call it that, and need to be boiled clean or replaced. This maintenance schedule wasn't arbitrary. It was based on observed performance degradation over time. When water flow through the filter slowed significantly, that indicated clogging. When filtered water began to taste less clean, that indicated charcoal saturation. When the cloth developed a slimy feeling, that indicated biological growth. These were practical indicators of filter condition that required no scientific instruments, just careful observation. The portable canteen filter Marcus developed was a practical compromise between effectiveness and portability. By combining sand and charcoal in a cloth bag suspended in the canteen, he created a simplified single-stage filter that was less effective than the multi-layer barrel system, but infinitely more practical for a man traveling through wilderness with minimal gear. The limitation of the portable filter was contact time. Water passing through a thin bag of sand and charcoal didn't have as much opportunity to interact with filtering materials as water slowly percolating through 2 feet of multiple layers. But even limited filtration was better than no filtration, and the portable system could turn moderately contaminated water into reasonably safe drinking water with an hour of patience. Marcus experimented with variations on the portable design. He tried double bag systems, where water passed through 2 separate filter bags in series. He experimented with different ratios of sand to charcoal, finding that roughly equal parts worked best for frontier conditions. He tested different cloth materials, discovering that tightly woven cotton was ideal, while loose-weave linen allowed too much material to pass through. These experiments weren't conducted in laboratories with controlled conditions. They were done through practical use in the field, with success measured by whether Marcus got sick or stayed healthy. This empirical approach was necessarily slower than formal scientific research, but it produced reliable results because the stakes were immediate and personal. By 1848, Marcus had refined his portable filter design to the point where he could teach it to another trapper in less than an hour. The system required a canteen or water bag, a tight weave cloth about 8 inches square, clean sand roasted over fire, crushed charcoal from hardwood, not pine, and cord to tie the filter bag closed and suspended inside the canteen. Construction was straightforward. Mix sand and charcoal in roughly equal proportions. Fold the cloth into a bag shape and tie off the bottom with cord. Fill the bag with the sand-charcoal mixture. Tie off the top, leaving enough cord to suspend the bag inside the canteen so it hung from the mouth. When filling the canteen, pour water in slowly so it had to pass through the filter bag before reaching the main chamber. Before drinking, wait at least 1 hour to let water that had just been poured finish filtering through. This simple system could be built with materials available at any trading post or gathered from the wilderness. It required no specialized tools beyond what any traveler carried. It added minimal weight to a pack, and it worked well enough to prevent most waterborne illnesses in frontier conditions. The spread of this knowledge through the trapper community followed the usual pattern of frontier information exchange. Marcus taught a few men directly. Those men taught others. The knowledge mutated and evolved as different trappers adapted the basic principles to their specific situations and available materials. Some versions became less effective through misunderstanding of key principles. Others became more refined through clever innovations. A trapper named John Coulter developed a double canteen system where water was filtered through one canteen into a second, allowing him to continue drinking filtered water while a new batch was being prepared. A French-Canadian named Pierre Leclerc figured out that cattail down could substitute for cloth in the filter bag, creating an even cheaper version that used only wild materials. Not all innovations worked. Some trappers tried using ash instead of charcoal, which was easier to produce but lacked charcoal's adsorptive properties and sometimes made water taste bitter. Others used pine charcoal because pine was more common in many regions, but pine resin could transfer into the water and cause digestive upset. The knowledge that worked was preserved through survival. Techniques that failed were discarded after making men sick. By 1850, water filtration had become standard practice among experienced mountain men, even if it remained controversial among immigrant populations. The disconnect between these groups reflected different knowledge systems and different consequences for error. Mountain men who relied on wilderness water sources for months at a time had strong incentive to adopt any technique that reduced illness. Immigrants who would reach Oregon in a few months could risk drinking unfiltered water because they'd presumably reach civilization before consequences caught up with them. Some got lucky, many didn't. The gold rush of 1849 created a massive natural experiment in water safety, though nobody understood it as such at the time. Tens of thousands of prospectors rushed to California, most traveling through areas with limited clean water. Mining camps sprang up around streams that became heavily contaminated as miners upstream dumped waste directly into the water that others drank downstream. The death toll was staggering. Estimates suggest that disease killed more prospectors than accidents, violence, and starvation combined. Cholera was a particular scourge in the mining camps, spreading rapidly through populations that drank from contaminated streams and had no understanding of how to protect themselves. But within this carnage were pockets of survival. Mining camps where someone understood water filtration and managed to convince others to adopt it had significantly lower disease rates than camps where no filtration was used. The data is fragmentary and anecdotal, but enough accounts exist to establish the pattern. Camp Madison, a mining operation in the Sierra foothills, maintained a communal water filter built according to the Printup family's original barrel design. Over the summer of 1849, no one in Camp Madison died from cholera, while surrounding camps lost dozens of men. The success of Camp Madison's filter spread by example. Other mining operations built their own filtration systems, often with Marcus Welch's help. He'd followed the gold rush like many trappers, though he was more interested in teaching water safety than in mining. By 1851, crude water filtration had become relatively common in successful mining camps, though implementation varied widely. Some camps built elaborate communal systems, with multiple barrel filters feeding a central clean water supply. Others relied on individual portable filters that each miner maintained for personal use. The most effective systems combined both approaches: communal filters for cooking and washing, portable filters for individual drinking water when working claims far from camp. The engineering that went into some of these mining camp filters was impressive. At Cache Creek Camp, a former civil engineer named Thomas Whitfield, no relation to Dr. Whitfield, designed a gravity-fed system that pulled water from upstream of the mining operations, passed it through a series of 3 barrel filters arranged in steps down a hillside, and delivered clean water to a holding tank at the center of camp. The system required no pumping, gravity did all the work, and could process enough water for a camp of 80 men. Whitfield's design incorporated several innovations beyond the basic print-up family system. He added a settling tank at the top, where heavily sediment-laden water could sit for several hours, allowing large particles to drop out before entering the filters. This reduced the rate at which the gravel layers became clogged. He used 3 filters in series rather than a single filter, which distributed the load and made maintenance easier. One filter could be cleaned while the other 2 continued operating. And he added a covered cistern at the bottom that protected clean water from recontamination by surface runoff or insects. This system, built entirely with materials available at a mining camp in 1851, embodied water treatment principles that matched what municipal systems would use decades later. Whitfield had no formal training in water treatment. That discipline barely existed in 1851. But he understood engineering principles and learned from the indigenous filtration knowledge that Marcus Welch had shared. The irony wasn't lost on those who paid attention. A civil engineer trained in the latest European methods had built his water system based on techniques developed by people who European society dismissed as primitive. The Native American knowledge that had been rejected by immigrants was now being implemented by educated engineers because it demonstrably saved lives. But credit rarely flowed back to the original developers of the technology. The medical establishment remained largely hostile to water filtration throughout the 1850s. Dr. Whitfield at Fort Laramie continued to insist that cholera was caused by miasmic vapors, even as the evidence mounted that contaminated water was the actual vector. When presented with the survival rates from mining camps that used filtration, he argued that those camps simply had better air quality or were located away from miasmic sources. This resistance wasn't unique to Dr. Whitfield. Medical professionals across America and Europe clung to miasma theory, despite growing evidence against it. The theory had the weight of centuries of medical tradition. Abandoning it meant admitting that much of medical practice had been based on incorrect understanding. That was a bitter pill for physicians to swallow, particularly when the alternative explanation came partly from primitive indigenous knowledge, rather than from formal medical research. The breakthrough in scientific understanding came, appropriately enough, from a physician who studied evidence rather than theory. Dr. John Snow in London had become convinced that cholera was waterborne after observing the pattern of cases during the 1854 outbreak. He famously traced an outbreak to a contaminated water pump on Broad Street, though his conclusions were initially rejected by medical authorities who remained committed to miasma theory. Snow's work wouldn't be fully accepted until decades later, after Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch developed germ theory and microscopy advanced to the point where bacteria could be observed directly. But Snow's methodology, careful observation of disease patterns, attention to the actual routes of transmission, willingness to challenge established theory when evidence contradicted it, matched the approach that had led indigenous peoples to develop water filtration centuries earlier. The Native American knowledge systems that preceded, and in some ways surpassed European medical understanding, were based on exactly this kind of empirical observation. Watch what happens. Note which actions lead to which outcomes. Test different approaches. Preserve what works, discard what doesn't. This is the scientific method, even without laboratories or publication in medical journals. The Printup family hadn't known about Vibrio cholera, but they'd observed that people who drank filtered water got cholera less often than people who drank unfiltered water. They didn't know about bacterial adsorption to charcoal surfaces, but they'd observed that charcoal made water safer to drink. They didn't have microscopes, but they had something more valuable in practical terms. They had generations of survival data showing that filtration worked. Marcus Welch's contribution was essentially that of a cultural translator. He learned techniques from an indigenous knowledge system, adapted them for use by European settlers, and worked to overcome the cultural barriers that prevented that knowledge from spreading. He wasn't the inventor of water filtration. That credit belonged to the indigenous peoples who developed the technique over centuries. He wasn't even the first white person to learn these techniques from Native Americans, but he was unusually effective at teaching others and unusually insistent about crediting his indigenous teachers. The records of Marcus's life after the gold rush are fragmentary. He continued working as a wilderness guide through the 1850s, teaching water filtration to groups he led and building filter systems at trading posts and forts across the frontier. He married a Shoshone woman named Mourning Dove in 1853, settling near the Wind River Range where he continued trapping and trading. An account from 1857, written by a missionary passing through Marcus's territory, describes visiting his cabin and seeing an elaborate water filtration system that processed water from a nearby stream. "Mr. Welch showed me his water filters with evident pride," the missionary wrote. He explained that he learned these techniques from Indians and insisted that white men would do well to listen more carefully to native peoples who have survived in these lands for centuries. He made a compelling argument, though I suspect his views are colored by his marriage to a native woman. That final sentence reveals the persistent prejudice even among those who acknowledge the effectiveness of indigenous techniques. The assumption was that Marcus advocated for native knowledge because of personal relationships, rather than because the techniques demonstrably worked better than European alternatives. The success of water filtration was attributed to everything except the sophisticated observational science that had developed it. Marcus Welch died in 1863, apparently from complications of a broken leg sustained in a fall from his horse. He was 53 years old. His obituary in the local territorial newspaper was brief. Marcus Welch, longtime resident and guide, passed away last week. He will be remembered for his knowledge of mountain trails and his insistence on filtered water, which many attributed to Indian superstitions he had adopted during his long association with native peoples. Even in death, his advocacy for indigenous knowledge was dismissed as superstition, rather than recognized as promotion of effective survival techniques. The pattern was depressingly consistent. When indigenous knowledge was adopted by white settlers, it was usually credited to frontier ingenuity or common sense, rather than to the people who had developed and refined it over generations. The broader impact of water filtration knowledge is impossible to quantify precisely, but we can make reasonable estimates. In the period from 1847 to 1860, cholera killed an estimated 50,000 to 75,000 people in the United States, with frontier regions particularly hard hit. Mining camps, immigrant trails, and trading posts suffered mortality rates that sometimes exceeded 10% of the population during epidemic years. Communities that adopted water filtration consistently showed lower mortality rates than those that didn't. The difference wasn't absolute. Filtration didn't eliminate all waterborne disease, but it was substantial. In mining camps with filtration systems, cholera mortality was typically 2 to 3% of the population during epidemic years. In camps without filtration, mortality ranged from 8 to 12%. That difference represents thousands of lives. The long-term cultural impact is harder to assess, but arguably more important. The reluctant, partial acceptance of indigenous water filtration techniques was part of a broader pattern where European settlers slowly learned that Native American peoples possessed sophisticated knowledge systems that were often better adapted to frontier conditions than European practices. This realization didn't lead to widespread respect for indigenous cultures. Frontier history is too brutal for such easy redemption narratives. Native American populations continued to be displaced, their knowledge systems destroyed or suppressed, their contributions to American survival rarely acknowledged. But individual settlers who learned from indigenous teachers often survived when those who relied solely on European knowledge died. The modern relevance of this history extends beyond historical interest. The basic principles of water filtration that Marcus Welch learned from the Printup family remain the foundation of both large-scale municipal water treatment and portable survival filters. Every backpacker carrying a water filter, every municipality operating a treatment plant, every military unit using field purification systems is using technology that indigenous peoples developed centuries before European settlement of the Americas. Modern backpacking water filters use ceramic filters, chemical treatments, or UV light, in addition to the traditional sand charcoal cloth filtration that Marcus taught. But the multi-layer, multi-mechanism approach to water purification remains the same. Remove large particles mechanically. Trap smaller particles in fine filters. Use chemical adsorption to remove dissolved contaminants. This is the same strategy that indigenous filtration systems employed, just implemented with modern materials and scaled to different contexts. The development of activated carbon filtration, now standard in water purification worldwide, follows directly from the charcoal filtration techniques that Native American peoples used for generations. Modern activated carbon is produced through high-temperature processing that increases surface area and adsorptive capacity beyond what primitive charcoal production could achieve. But the fundamental principle, that charcoal can remove contaminants from water through adsorption, was understood and applied by indigenous peoples long before the chemistry was explained. Contemporary survival training for military personnel and wilderness guides typically includes instruction in water filtration using multi-layer systems nearly identical to what the Printup family taught Marcus Welch. The materials may be different. Modern gear uses nylon cloth instead of cotton, synthetic bags instead of buffalo stomach, carefully graded filter media instead of river sand. But the layered approach and the basic physics remain unchanged. This continuity raises uncomfortable questions about how knowledge is credited and preserved. The indigenous peoples who developed water filtration techniques over centuries of careful observation and refinement are rarely mentioned in contemporary discussions of water treatment technology. The knowledge is presented as a universal discovery or credited to European researchers who formalized the science decades or centuries after the techniques were in practical use. This historical amnesia isn't unique to water filtration. Countless survival techniques, agricultural practices, medicinal treatments, and engineering solutions that are now considered standard knowledge originated with indigenous peoples whose contributions have been systematically erased from the historical record. The erasure happened partly through deliberate suppression of indigenous knowledge systems, partly through the assumption that techniques learned from Native Americans were so obvious that they didn't require attribution, and partly through the simple fact that oral knowledge systems don't leave the same historical trail as written records. The story of Marcus Welch and frontier water filtration is, in the end, a story about knowledge, power, and survival. It's about life-saving information that was dismissed because of cultural prejudice. It's about the slow, painful process by which European settlers learned to listen to indigenous teachers, usually after paying enormous costs in preventable deaths. It's about the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom, and how survival often depends more on the latter than the former. When Marcus knelt beside the Platte River in the summer of 1847 and drank water that was killing people daily, he was demonstrating the power of indigenous knowledge. The cholera bacteria in that water were invisible, undetectable by sight or smell, but the filtration system he'd learned from the Printup family removed them effectively enough that he remained healthy while others died. This wasn't magic or luck. It was engineering based on careful observation, refined over generations. The lesson should have been obvious. Indigenous peoples who had survived in challenging environments for thousands of years possessed valuable knowledge about how to do so safely. Their techniques were often more effective than European alternatives that were based on theory rather than empirical testing. And the fastest way to die on the frontier was to let cultural prejudice prevent you from learning from people who understood the environment better than you did. But obvious lessons often went unlearned in frontier America. The pattern Marcus observed at Fort Laramie, emigrants dying while refusing to adopt the indigenous techniques that could save them, repeated throughout westward expansion. It happened with shelter construction, where settlers built cabins that failed in mountain winters while dismissing Native American structural techniques as primitive. It happened with food preservation, where European methods often failed in frontier conditions while indigenous techniques worked reliably. It happened with navigation, where settlers got lost and died while ignoring indigenous route knowledge. The cost of this cultural arrogance was measured in thousands of deaths that could have been prevented if people had been willing to learn from those who came before. Marcus Welch saved some of those lives by serving as a bridge between knowledge systems. He learned from indigenous teachers, adapted their techniques to make them accessible to other settlers, and persistently worked to overcome the prejudice that prevented knowledge from spreading. But he couldn't save everyone. He couldn't overcome centuries of cultural assumptions about whose knowledge was valuable and whose could be dismissed. He couldn't change the fundamental dynamic of frontier settlement, where indigenous peoples were displaced and their knowledge systems destroyed, even as their techniques were quietly adopted by those who replaced them. The water filters Marcus built and taught others to build were still in use at mining camps and frontier outposts well into the 1870s. Some of the communal filtration systems constructed in the 1850s remained operational for decades, maintained by communities that understood their value, even if they'd forgotten or never known their indigenous origins. The portable canteen filters Marcus designed became standard gear for experienced wilderness travelers, passed from old hand to newcomer as practical survival knowledge. But the credit didn't follow the knowledge. When water filtration became accepted practice, when municipalities began building treatment systems based on the same principles, when the science was finally formalized and published, the indigenous peoples who had developed the techniques centuries earlier were rarely mentioned. The knowledge was presented as a modern discovery, credited to European researchers, divorced from its roots in careful indigenous observation and engineering. This pattern of appropriation, without attribution, continues to affect how we understand frontier history. The myth of self-sufficient European settlers conquering wilderness through ingenuity and determination obscures the reality that survival often depended on indigenous knowledge that settlers learned, adopted, and then claimed as their own innovation. The truth is more complicated and less flattering to the mythology of American expansion. Marcus Welch's story matters because it reveals these complications, while also offering hope that knowledge can sometimes cross cultural boundaries when survival demands it. He wasn't a perfect advocate for indigenous knowledge. He was still a white settler who benefited from systems that oppressed the people who taught him. But he made genuine efforts to credit his teachers, to spread their techniques, and to challenge the prejudices that prevented life-saving knowledge from being accepted. The water that flowed through his filters, transformed from contaminated danger to safe drinking water by layers of gravel, sand, and charcoal, was a small victory against disease and ignorance. Each person who learned to build a filter, each camp that set up a filtration system, each life saved by adopting indigenous water purification techniques represented a moment when knowledge proved more powerful than prejudice. Those moments weren't common enough. The frontier was full of people like Robert Morrison, who dismissed indigenous knowledge even as cholera killed members of his wagon train. It was full of people like Dr. Whitfield, who clung to incorrect medical theory rather than accept that primitives might understand disease transmission better than trained physicians. The resistance to indigenous knowledge was systematic and deadly, rooted in cultural assumptions that valued European formal education over practical survival wisdom. But there were also people like the immigrants who built filters after watching Marcus demonstrate them. Like the miners who set up communal filtration systems after seeing how they prevented cholera. Like the trappers who quietly adopted indigenous techniques and stayed healthy in conditions that killed less adaptable men. These people recognized that survival mattered more than pride, that effective techniques deserved respect regardless of their origin, and that indigenous knowledge systems often reflected centuries of careful observation that European settlers couldn't match. The water filters that saved lives on the American frontier were physical embodiments of this recognition. Every layer of gravel, every handful of charcoal, every carefully woven cloth filter represented indigenous wisdom being passed forward, adapted, and used to prevent needless death. The technology was elegant in its simplicity and sophisticated in its effectiveness. It worked because it was based on empirical observation rather than theoretical models. It worked because indigenous peoples had refined it across generations, and it worked despite being dismissed by medical authorities who should have known better. Today, when we turn on taps and drink clean water without thinking about cholera, typhoid, or dysentery, we're benefiting from knowledge that traces directly back to the filtration techniques that Marcus Welch learned from the Printup family in 1844. The sophisticated municipal treatment systems that make modern urban life possible use the same layered, multi-mechanism approach to purification that indigenous peoples developed centuries ago. The portable filters that backpackers carry into wilderness areas work on principles that Native Americans understood and applied long before the microbiology was explained. This continuity should remind us that knowledge is knowledge, regardless of its source, that survival techniques refined through generations of use deserve respect, and that cultural prejudice costs lives by preventing the spread of life-saving information. The frontier would have been less deadly if more settlers had been willing to learn from indigenous teachers. Cities would have been healthier if medical authorities had accepted the evidence that water filtration worked even before they understood why. Thousands of deaths could have been prevented if knowledge had been valued over cultural assumptions. Marcus Welch couldn't change the broader dynamics of frontier history. He couldn't prevent the displacement of indigenous peoples or the destruction of their knowledge systems. He couldn't overcome the systemic prejudices that led people to die rather than adopt Indian techniques. But within the limited scope of his influence, he saved lives by teaching water filtration, and he honored his indigenous teachers by crediting them openly, even when doing so made his teachings less acceptable to prejudiced audiences. The filters he built are long gone now, broken down or abandoned, as the frontier settled and municipal water systems replaced wilderness survival techniques. But the knowledge persists in modified forms, carried forward through the generations that adopted and adapted indigenous water purification wisdom. Every time someone builds a survival water filter, every time a municipal system processes contaminated water into safe drinking water, every time a backpacker pumps water through a portable filtration system, they're using technology that owes its existence to the careful observations and sophisticated engineering of indigenous peoples who understood that clean water was the foundation of survival. That debt deserves acknowledgement. The indigenous knowledge systems that developed water filtration, that perfected it across centuries, that shared it with settlers who were dying from waterborne disease. These systems represented sophisticated science that has saved millions of lives. The people who developed this knowledge, who refined these techniques, who taught them to people like Marcus Welch, despite having every reason to withhold help from invaders who were displacing them, they deserve credit that history has largely denied them. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of frontier survival. Much of what we celebrate as pioneer ingenuity was actually indigenous knowledge, adopted reluctantly, credited rarely, and preserved incompletely. The story of water filtration is just one example among thousands. Every domain of frontier life, food, shelter, medicine, navigation, survival techniques, shows the same pattern of indigenous innovation being adopted by settlers and then presented as universal discovery or European ingenuity. Recognizing this history doesn't diminish the real struggles of frontier settlers or the courage it took to push into challenging environments, but it does complicate the narrative of conquest and self-sufficiency that has dominated American frontier mythology. The truth is messier and more interconnected. Survival depended on knowledge sharing across cultures, even in contexts of conflict and displacement. The settlers who survived were often those humble enough to learn from indigenous teachers. The settlers who died were often those whose pride prevented them from accepting help from people they viewed as inferior. Marcus Welch, kneeling beside a contaminated river and drinking water that should have killed him, represented the power of knowledge to cross cultural boundaries when survival demanded it. His story is a small one in the vast sweep of frontier history, but it reveals essential truths about how knowledge spreads, how prejudice impedes survival, and how indigenous wisdom saved lives, even as indigenous peoples were being systematically destroyed. The water that dripped through his filter, transformed from deadly threat to safe refreshment by simple layers of natural materials, arranged with care and understanding, was a quiet victory for knowledge over ignorance. Every drop represented survival through adaptation, learning through necessity, and the grudging recognition that sometimes the people you dismiss as primitive understand the world better than you do. That lesson remains relevant. In an era of climate change and environmental challenges, indigenous knowledge about sustainable living and environmental management deserves attention rather than dismissal. In an era of global health crises, traditional medical knowledge refined over centuries deserves respect alongside formal medical science. In an era of water scarcity, the sophisticated water management techniques that indigenous peoples developed deserve study and implementation. The frontier water filters that saved lives in the 1800s weren't just historical curiosities. They were proof that knowledge systems we dismiss as primitive often embody sophisticated understanding developed through careful observation. They were demonstrations that survival sometimes requires humility to learn from those who came before. And they were warnings about the costs, measured in preventable deaths, of letting cultural prejudice block the transmission of life-saving knowledge. Marcus Welch understood this. The Printup family who taught him understood this. The indigenous peoples who developed water filtration over centuries understood this. Some frontier settlers learned this lesson in time to save themselves. Many others didn't, and they died clutching their theories about miasmic vapors while cholera bacteria multiplied in the water they refused to filter, because doing so would mean admitting that Indians knew something they didn't. The choice between pride and survival should have been obvious. The number of people who chose pride reveals how powerful cultural prejudice can be, even in the face of death. The people who chose survival, who built filters and learned techniques and credited their indigenous teachers, left a legacy that extends far beyond their individual lives. They preserved knowledge that continues to save lives today, even if the chain of transmission has been largely forgotten. When you drink filtered water today, whether from a municipal tap or a backpacking filter, take a moment to consider where that technology came from. Think about the indigenous peoples who observed that some water made people sick, while filtered water didn't. Think about the generations of careful refinement that perfected multi-layer filtration. Think about the teachers who shared this knowledge with desperate settlers, despite having every reason to withhold it. And think about the people like Marcus Welch, who served as bridges between knowledge systems, who preserved and spread indigenous wisdom, who saved lives by teaching techniques they freely credited to their indigenous sources. That's the real story of frontier water filtration. Not a tale of European innovation conquering wilderness challenges, but a story of indigenous knowledge saving lives, despite systematic prejudice against acknowledging that knowledge. It's a story that should make us question other frontier narratives, that should make us look more carefully at whose contributions have been erased from history, and that should make us more humble about assuming that formal education always trumps practical wisdom, refined through generations of survival. The water still flows through the mountains and across the plains where these events unfolded. The rivers still carry sediment and sometimes disease. The need for clean water hasn't changed. What has changed is that we now have the benefit of knowledge systems that were nearly destroyed, preserved partly through people like Marcus Welch, who recognized value in indigenous techniques and worked to spread that knowledge despite facing resistance from their own culture. That knowledge, carried forward and refined, continues to save lives. The filters in municipal water systems, the portable purification systems in emergency kits, the survival techniques taught to wilderness travelers, all trace their lineage back to the indigenous peoples who first understood that water needed purification and who developed elegant solutions using natural materials and careful observation. This is their legacy, not monuments or written records, but living knowledge that persists because it works, that spreads because it saves lives, that endures despite systematic attempts to erase the contributions of its indigenous developers. Every time someone drinks clean water, made safe through multi-layer filtration, they're benefiting from indigenous science that preceded European settlement by centuries. That debt deserves acknowledgement. Those teachers deserve credit. And the lessons about cultural prejudice impeding survival deserve remembering, so that future generations don't repeat the deadly mistakes of dismissing knowledge based on its source rather than its effectiveness. Marcus Welch learned that lesson beside a contaminated river, taught it to anyone who would listen, and saved lives by building filters one person at a time. His story, and the indigenous knowledge that made it possible, deserves to be told, not as a footnote to frontier history, but as a central narrative about how survival depends on knowledge crossing cultural boundaries, how prejudice kills by preventing learning, and how some of the most sophisticated science can come from sources that formal institutions dismiss as primitive. The water filters work. They always have. The question is whether we're humble enough to learn from the people who developed them, honest enough to credit the true sources of our survival techniques, and wise enough to recognize that knowledge is knowledge, regardless of who discovered it first. If this story resonated with you, leave a like to help others discover these frontier histories. Thanks for exploring the Old West archives with us.